Greetings, underground dwellers.
And welcome back.
My name's Ian.
And I'm Steve.
And we're talking to you today about the Downbelow RPG and why your characters don't advance.
Which sounds really, really weird when you talk about it, because in every game ever, characters advance, right?
One of the aspects that is a defining mechanic for does it have RPG mechanics in especially video games when you're describing them is, do you have an experience system and advancing characters? So how can we take that out and still be a role-playing game? Well, it's actually not a core feature of role-playing games. In fact, it wasn't a core feature until Dungeons & Dragons had, a second or third version, because in the original version, before they published the Little Brown Books, they had just characters, and they came out of a wargaming context. And we are in a completely different context than that, though. So why aren't we doing it?
For one reason, in most games, and here I'm actually not talking about role-playing games specifically, I'm talking about games across the board, the question is not how much have you amassed through character growth. The question is what resources have you acquired and how do you use them. This is true in everything from video games. The original Super Mario Brothers is one where your capabilities as an avatar are literally the same from the start of the game to the end of the game. Similarly, in more modern terms, all the various Halo games, as soon as an item is unlocked, that item is available if the level says it's available, not if you have leveled up your sniper rifle skill. In board games, any advancement that happens is usually part of a scenario. Games like Zombicide have your character leveling up, but they don't retain that from scenario to scenario, and it's perfectly possible to win the game without hitting that maximum level. Other games, such as Arkham Horror, just straight up don't require you to level up at all.
In fact, you rebalance different sets of traits, which you trade one thing for another throughout the course of the game.
If you look at literature, finally, classics like Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit show great character growth over the course of the book, but for most of the characters, their stats would not have changed from the beginning to the end.
Some of them would, especially the hobbits.
Exactly.
But some of them, especially the wizards, definitely not.
Gandalf did not gain any levels.
I mean, maybe once during Lord of the Rings, because he actually got a spiritual promotion, but it took him all of The Hobbit, all of the first book and a half, and then coming back later after an epic confrontation, and that's basically a change of nature, not so much leveling up in the D&D sense.
So since the leveling up and character advancement is actually far from core to any of our inspirational material, why make it core to our game?
So that's one angle that we come at it from, and another angle is the game mechanics angle, where in a lot of RPGs and games in general, your attributes for your character, when you have numerical attributes, and your traits are representing simulation of capability within the world.
Yep.
So when you have a Dungeons & Dragons character and they have strength and dexterity, those represent a certain amount of ability to lift things and a certain amount of reaction speed. And when you've got intelligence, that represents a certain ability with equations and logic. And our game is not about simulation.
For one thing, whenever you're simulating something, unless you're trying to go for a complete simulation, you're going to leave things out. In D&D, sure, intelligence covers equations and mathematics and memorization, but what about cleverness? Is that intelligence? Is it wisdom? Is it charisma? Is it some combination of the three? Is it not represented at all? Is it a skill?
Is it entirely a player thing?
Right.
So the fact that we are not going for simulation means that in most of these scenarios, if you want the player to accomplish a more difficult, more epic task, such as, okay, you have gone from the point where you are fighting 2 or 3 orcs at a time as a group, to the point where you are now fighting armies of 50 to 100 orcs at a time as a group, and so on, the numbers need to go up because the numbers that simulate how difficult these tasks are, the number that you need to have goes up to, represent that simulation.
But in the case of Downbelow, rather than having the numbers go up, what you need to do is find appropriate tools for the job.
And you need to be in an appropriate story situation. So if you are a character who has just started off and you are Joe off the street, then you cannot be in the position to attempt the task to take over Yggdrasil Corporation and repurpose it to your own ends. But if you have played through a long and involved story arc where you and your few friends infiltrate the corporation and find all the secret key codes and put your secret backdoors into the system so that you can take over all of the space elevators for your own nefarious purposes because you wanted to play that game, then after you have gone through all of the steps in the story, you might be in a situation where you could say, if I succeed at this task, I will have control of Yggdrasil.
The nice thing about this from a storytelling and GMing perspective is this actually does put us in a position that is enjoyed not in role-playing games, but in comic books and pulp literature. In a role-playing game, the goblins that menaced you at level 1, by the time you hit about level 4 or 5, need to resort to extreme measures to be anything even resembling a threat. However, in literature, whether it's comic books, whether it's pulp fiction, whether it's pretty much anything out there, if something is established as a threat early on, it really remains a threat unless you're able to remove it as a threat somehow. The mooks that Jimmy Marconi sends against you at the start of the game are going to be just as threatening 10 sessions down the line as they were in session number 1. And that's something fairly unique.
In our inspirational material, we were looking at situations where the same person who can take down somehow this epic threat at the end of the story in the start of the very next story is still going to be threatened by a regular person with a regular pistol who isn't an epic threat. And we wanted to make something that could represent that.
This is not to say, as we've talked about before, that characters never change. Instead, what's more likely to happen is that as certain skills and certain traits are unused, they're going to drop off the character sheet at the player's decision and be replaced with stuff that is more appropriate to where you're going now. Lateral change is not the same as numbers going up, character growth, and character development is not the same as leveling up.
So, in short, we don't have character advancement like most games do as a default thing in Downbelow because you don't need it, and in fact, you better represent the kind of story that most of the inspirational material for role-playing games in literature, movies, comic books, and so on shows you by not having the characters have numbers go up and instead having the characters be good at what they're good at and succeed and fail in an amount that feels right to make a story.
That's all we've got for this time. Tune in next time as we return back to the world of Downbelow for more uniqueness.